When I first studied the nuclear balance at West Point, I learned a lesson that never left me. The only thing more dangerous than nuclear weapons is believing they can be abolished. Deterrence has always rested on a paradox that peace depends on the credible threat of destruction. Today, as Washington resumes nuclear testing, that paradox returns to the forefront of global strategy. The official justification is straightforward. Russia and China are expanding and modernizing their arsenals, and the United States must ensure its own weapons remain functional, reliable, and capable of deterring both simultaneously. But behind that rationale lies a deeper reality. The American strategic order, built on uncontested dominance since 1991, is beginning to fracture. Deterrence in a multipolar world is no longer about one adversary. It's about maintaining equilibrium among several nuclear powers with diverging interests and growing confidence. For decades, American leaders treated deterrence as a solved problem, a relic of the Cold War that could be managed by treaties and sanctions. The logic was that if the United States possessed overwhelming superiority, no adversary would dare challenge it. But history shows that deterrence erodes when power diffuses. Russia rebuilt its nuclear triad after the 2000s, investing in hypersonic delivery systems that the U.S. has yet to match. China, once a distant third, is now constructing hundreds of new missile silos in Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia. Both nations test frequently, refine designs, and align their nuclear postures with regional ambitions. Meanwhile, the United States has not conducted a full-scale nuclear test since 1992. For over 3 decades, Washington has relied on computer simulations and lab verification, technical marvels, yes, but untested in the field. When Trump ordered the Department of War to immediately resume testing, he was not simply reviving the Cold War. He was admitting that deterrence without proof risks credibility. To understand why deterrence matters, one must recall the lessons of past empires. Britain's naval supremacy collapsed when it failed to adapt to industrial competition. The Soviet Union's nuclear deterrent preserved its sovereignty but could not save its economy. America's own deterrent, once guaranteed not just security but strategic reach, the ability to project force anywhere, anytime. That illusion of omnipotence is what's collapsing now. Deterrence today is no longer about dominance. It's about survival. When adversaries believe the United States can no longer sustain its commitments, whether in Europe, the Pacific, or the Middle East, they begin to test the boundaries, first with small provocations, then with open defiance. That's the real meaning behind Moscow's nuclear signaling in Ukraine and Beijing's military drills around Taiwan. They are probing the limits of American resolve, not its rhetoric. Some will see the return of U.S. nuclear testing as reckless, even destabilizing. But the reality is that deterrence cannot survive on declarations alone. Power must be demonstrated. A credible deterrent must be visible, modern, and unquestioned by allies and adversaries alike. Yet resuming tests also signals something uncomfortable. that Washington's strategic foundation has weakened to the point where reassurance now requires spectacle. A confident empire does not need to prove its strength. An anxious one does. The question is not whether testing will make America safer, but whether it marks the beginning of a new era of strategic competition, one defined less by diplomacy and more by deterrent posturing among nuclear peers. In that sense, the logic of deterrence has not changed. Only its geography has power has shifted east, and the U.S. is now reacting, not leading. That more than the tests themselves reveals the true nature of decline. In every era of great power decline, there comes a moment when superiority becomes memory, when the instruments of dominance remain, but the confidence that once animated them fades. For the United States, that moment began quietly after the Cold War, when strategic triumph bred complacency. We mistook temporary supremacy for permanence. Our nuclear arsenal was considered invincible, our military unrivaled, our alliances unquestioned. But while Washington indulged in illusions of unipolarity, the world adjusted. Russia rebuilt its command structures. China began a silent ascent, and regional powers from Iran to North Korea studied our interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, learning how to exploit our weaknesses. By the time policymakers in Washington realized the strategic balance had shifted, the machinery of superiority had already eroded. The U.S. had overextended its commitments, drained its industrial base, and diluted deterrence through endless wars of choice. The erosion was not technological but psychological. Superiority depends as much on perception as on capability. When allies doubt your staying power and adversaries sense your restraint, deterrence begins to crumble from within. The Pentagon's own studies over the past decade have acknowledged this trend. America's shipyards can no longer outproduce China's. Its missile defense systems are increasingly vulnerable to hypersonic strikes. Its global logistics chains depend on fragile networks of allies who may not fight when pressed. The assumption that the United States could fight and win two major wars simultaneously, once a cornerstone of its defense doctrine, has quietly vanished. What remains is a scattered forward presence stretched across continents, dependent on bases and supply lines that are increasingly exposed. Superiority in name only. When Trump ordered the resumption of nuclear testing, he was, in effect, admitting what few in Washington will say aloud: the deterrent structure of the post-Cold War world no longer guarantees dominance. For 30 years, the U.S. relied on treaties and deterrence by reputation, the belief that American might, once demonstrated, would never need to be proven again. That worked as long as no peer rival existed, but the reemergence of Russia and the rise of China have shattered that illusion. Deterrence now operates under conditions of near parity, where miscalculation carries existential risk. The decision to test again To revalidate the arsenal is both a strategic necessity and a confession of vulnerability. Uh, a superpower confident in its primacy does not need to prove it still works. This loss of superiority is not irreversible, but it is cumulative. It stems from decades of distraction, from wars fought in deserts while shipyards rusted, from sanctions masquerading as strategy, from the belief that economic globalization could substitute for hard power. As a soldier, I have seen what happens when strategy is built on assumptions rather than realities. The American way of war, built on overwhelming force and technological dominance, is ill-suited to an era of distributed power where smaller states can achieve deterrence through precision, resilience, and alliance with stronger patrons. Superiority cannot be rebuilt with slogans. It requires recalibration of ambition. The question now is whether Washington can accept strategic limits before events impose them. History suggests empires rarely do. Most believe their superiority is eternal until the first decisive loss proves otherwise. America is not yet there, but the ground beneath its strategic order is already shifting. For much of the 20th century, deterrence operated within a binary structure. The United States and the Soviet Union held the world in a nuclear standoff defined by symmetry: two superpowers, two arsenals, two competing ideologies. Each understood that war would mean annihilation. That symmetry, paradoxically, kept the peace, but the end of the Cold War dissolved that framework without replacing it. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Washington assumed that deterrence itself had become obsolete, that the age of nuclear rivalry was over. We began to speak of disarmament, of non-proliferation, as if technology and ambition could be contained by treaties alone. We were wrong. The old bipolar order has given way to something more dangerous, a multipolar landscape where several powers now possess the means to deter, challenge, or paralyze the United States simultaneously. Russia, China, and increasingly regional actors like North Korea, Pakistan, and Iran each now operate under their own logic of deterrence. Moscow's nuclear posture is integrated into its conventional strategy, tactical, flexible, designed to offset NATO's technological edge. Beijing, on the other hand, has pursued silent expansion. For years, Chinese officials repeated the mantra of a minimum deterrent, yet satellite imagery now reveals hundreds of new missile silos under construction, the rapid growth of its submarine fleet, and the development of hypersonic glide vehicles that can bypass U.S. missile defenses. This is no longer minimum. It is parity in motion. Meanwhile, North Korea continues testing, not to win a war, but to ensure regime survival. Iran inches closer to a threshold capability, calculating that possessing or even approaching a nuclear deterrent guarantees bargaining power. The multipolar system has arrived, and with it, the return of unpredictability. In this environment, deterrence becomes more complex and less stable. The old clarity of mutual assured destruction no longer applies when several actors hold partial deterrence with differing thresholds for escalation. Washington's traditional advantage, the ability to threaten overwhelming retaliation, loses, meaning when adversaries are willing to absorb limited destruction to achieve strategic aims, China's calculation over Taiwan, for instance, may not be deterred by nuclear threats if Beijing believes the United States would never risk Los Angeles for Taipei. Likewise, Russia's integration of nuclear signaling into conventional war in Ukraine demonstrates how limited deterrence can be used to constrain U.S. responses without crossing the threshold of general war. Multipolarity does not eliminate deterrence, it fragments it. For the United States, this shift demands a redefinition of what deterrence means. It is no longer about dominance, but management, ensuring that no single conflict spirals into total confrontation. Yet Washington continues to act as though it can dictate outcomes everywhere, maintaining a Cold War posture in a world that has outgrown it. Deterrence today requires restraint as much as readiness. To threaten every adversary at once is to dilute credibility everywhere. A strategy of selective engagement focusing on core interests rather than ideological crusades is the only sustainable path. But in political culture, restraint is often mistaken for weakness. And so the cycle continues: new deployments, new commitments, new risks. The rise of multipolar deterrence marks not just a redistribution of power, but the end of certainty. The world is once again a battlefield of calculation, not conviction, and America must relearn the discipline of strategic humility before the logic of escalation teaches it instead. Nuclear weapons were never meant to be seen. Their power lies in the imagination, in what they could do, not in what they must do. Yet, every few decades, when the world forgets that reality, great powers return to the theater of demonstration. That is what Washington has done by ordering new nuclear tests. The act is not about engineering. It's about signaling. Tells Moscow and Beijing that the age of symbolic restraint is over, that the United States is willing, once again, to use visibility as deterrence. In the 1950s, America tested for supremacy. In the 1980s, for reassurance. Today, it tests for relevance. This is what happens when strategy becomes performance, when the spectacle replaces quiet strength. To resume testing after 30 years is not a step backward in technology. It is a reflection of anxiety, a ritual designed to remind adversaries that the old empire still breathes. The danger of spectacle is that it transforms deterrence into competition. Russia and China will not view this as reassurance, but provocation. Moscow has already hinted at reciprocal actions, and Beijing, though measured, has increased its missile drills in the Pacific. Each demonstration invites another, and soon deterrence becomes theater, an escalating cycle of proof. During the Cold War, both sides learned this lesson painfully. The United States detonated more than 1,000 devices. The Soviet Union nearly as many. Each test deepened the illusion that security could be measured in megatons. Yet despite the destructive spectacle, neither side ever achieved true dominance. What ended the arms race was not testing, but exhaustion, the realization that no quantity of explosions could make nuclear war winnable. Today's leaders, surrounded by digital simulations and sanitized briefings, risk forgetting that lesson. They believe demonstration equals deterrence, when, in truth, it signals insecurity. For Beijing, this return to spectacle presents an opportunity. China's strategy has always favored ambiguity, hiding strength, testing quietly, building incrementally. If Washington stages visible tests, Beijing can claim restraint, positioning itself as the rational power on the world stage while continuing expansion beneath the radar. That is how strategic narratives shift. The nuclear spectacle may reassure Americans for a season, but it may also isolate them diplomatically. Nations that once looked to the U.S. for stability now view its gestures with unease. Even allies such as Japan and Germany, long under the American umbrella, have begun debating autonomous deterrence. Spectacle erodes confidence. It suggests that what was once assured now needs to be proven. The paradox of power is that the more visibly it must be displayed, the less credible it becomes. A strong state does not need to show its weapons to remind others it possesses them. A declining one performs strength to mask uncertainty. This is the essence of the nuclear spectacle now unfolding. Deterrence. Once a quiet logic of discipline has become a stage act for domestic reassurance and international posturing. But as history shows, empires that mistake visibility for strength often invite the very confrontations they seek to deter. The Soviet Union learned that lesson in Afghanistan, Britain in Suez, and now the United States risks learning it in the Pacific. The nuclear spectacle may buy time, but it cannot buy stability. The more Washington relies on demonstration, the clearer it becomes that confidence has given way to performance, and that the empire, in its final act, seeks comfort not in power, but in proof. Power, in theory, flows from command, but in practice, the command is only as strong as the system that sustains it, the institutions, the communication networks, the discipline, and the clarity of purpose that hold a military together when pressure mounts. The United States once mastered this art. Our command and control structure during the Cold War was the envy of the world, layered, redundant, decisive. Nuclear launch protocols were built on precision timing, strict hierarchies, and the assumption of rational leadership. Yet, as decades passed and the machinery of empire expanded, that precision eroded under bureaucracy, politics, and technological complexity. The American command system today is more connected, but less coherent. It is larger, but not necessarily more effective Every new layer of cyber integration, every delegation of authority to autonomous systems or allied networks introduces more points of failure. In deterrence, fragility is fatal because uncertainty at the top can cascade into paralysis or catastrophe below. When I commanded armored units in Europe, I learned that control depends on clarity, the ability to issue orders that cannot be misinterpreted. But Washington's strategic command now operates in a fog of political interference and bureaucratic inertia. Senior officers are chosen as much for alignment as for judgment. Civilian leaders issue statements that contradict one another within hours. The Pentagon speaks of modernization while Congress delays funding. The chain of command, once an instrument of unity, has become an ecosystem of divided loyalties and competing agendas. The most dangerous phrase in deterrence is mixed signals. Adversaries read hesitation as weakness. Allies read it as doubt. Both erode the credibility that keeps wars from starting. That fragility is not hypothetical, it is visible in every crisis, from Afghanistan's collapse to the unsteady management of Ukraine policy, where decisions are made reactively, not strategically. Technology, once the guarantor of control, now amplifies risk. Artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, and real-time surveillance have compressed decision cycles to minutes. The old logic of deliberation that nuclear decisions must pass through layers of human judgment is collapsing under the weight of automation. Machines don't understand context. Algorithms don't feel fear. A sensor glitch, a cyber intrusion, or a false positive can trigger escalation faster than leaders can intervene. During the Cold War, we feared accidental war by miscalculation. Today, we risk it through overconnectivity. The human element that once restrained the system is being replaced by a digital reflex, fast, efficient, and dangerously blind. But the greatest fragility of command lies not in machines, but in the minds of those who wield them. A generation of leaders has grown up detached from the consequences of war. They see deterrence as policy language, not existential risk. They talk casually of tactical nukes and escalation ladders, as though annihilation could be managed by bureaucracy. The longer a superpower goes without direct confrontation, the more abstract its sense of danger becomes. That is how mistakes are made. The fragility of command today is psychological as much as structural. It stems from overconfidence in systems, underestimation of opponents, and an inability to imagine failure. History punishes that combination ruthlessly. Every empire believes its command system is infallible until it fails once. And once is all it takes. The measure of strategy is not the size of the arsenal, but the resilience of the mind that controls it. Right now, that mind is distracted, divided, and dangerously sure of itself. Every empire in decline begins to believe its own myths. For the United States, the illusion has taken many forms: that technology can replace strategy, that alliances guarantee loyalty, that markets ensure stability, that exceptionalism exempts us from history. Each illusion feeds the next until power becomes performance, a language of dominance unmoored from discipline. I have watched this transformation unfold over decades. From the Balkans to Baghdad, Washington's wars became spectacles of precision that achieved nothing enduring. Victory was declared before objectives were defined. We told ourselves that democracy could be airdropped, that deterrence could be maintained by press conferences and sanctions, that the empire was moral because its intentions were pure, but the world is not persuaded by words. It watches behavior, and what it has seen is a nation that confuses motion with strength, wealth with power, and power with wisdom. The illusion runs deep within the American psyche. We built an empire on the conviction that history had ended, that no rival could rise again. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we mistook opportunity for entitlement. We expanded commitments instead of consolidating them, scattering troops across continents under the banner of stability. Yet each new deployment eroded the very stability we sought. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria all served as mirrors, reflecting the same illusion that force could substitute for foresight. Now, as we return to nuclear testing, the illusion is turned inward. It is no longer about spreading ideals. It is about convincing ourselves that superiority still exists. We test not because the enemy doubts us, but because we doubt ourselves. That is the final stage of illusion, when performance replaces confidence and fear masquerades as strength. Empires sustain illusions through ritual. Rome paraded its legions long after its treasury emptied. Britain celebrated its navy while ceding dominion. The United States, armed with media and myths, does it through narrative control. We speak of defending freedom while censoring dissent, of spreading order while fueling disorder, of deterrence while courting escalation. The contradictions are not accidents. They are the grammar of decline. When leaders can no longer align rhetoric with reality, they govern through perception. The danger is not just deception of others, but self-deception. A republic that believes it cannot fail will not reform. It will double down on delusion until the cost becomes unbearable. The illusion of omnipotence blinds even the military establishment. We speak of near-peer competitors as though parity were temporary, as though history were a series of inconveniences to be overcome by budget increases. But no amount of funding can buy coherence, and no modernization program can compensate for strategic drift. The empire's strength is real, but its purpose is hollow. Deterrence without direction becomes reaction. That is where we stand now, reacting to others' initiatives, defending positions that no longer matter, mistaking inertia for resolve. The tragedy is not that America lacks power, but that it no longer understands how to use it wisely. When illusion governs command, decline. accelerates silently. The empire of illusions is not sustained by enemies abroad, but by the comfort of denial within, and like every empire before it, we will discover that illusions, once shattered, leave nothing but the truth we refuse to face. Every empire in decline begins to believe its own myths. For the United States, the illusion has taken many forms that technology can replace strategy, that alliances guarantee loyalty, that markets ensure stability, that exceptionalism exempts us from history. Each illusion feeds the next until power becomes performance, a language of dominance unmoored from discipline. I have watched this transformation unfold over decades. From the Balkans to Baghdad, Washington's wars became spectacles of precision that achieved nothing enduring. Victory was declared before objectives were defined. We told ourselves that democracy could be airdropped, that deterrence could be maintained by press conferences and sanctions, that the empire was moral because its intentions were pure. But the world is not persuaded by words. It watches behavior, and what it has seen is a nation that confuses motion with strength, wealth with power, and power with wisdom. The illusion runs deep within the American psyche. We built an empire on the conviction that history had ended, that no rival could rise again. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we mistook opportunity for entitlement. We expanded commitments instead of consolidating them, scattering troops across continents under the banner of stability. Yet each new deployment eroded the very stability we sought. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria all served as mirrors, reflecting the same illusion that force could substitute for foresight. Now, as we return to nuclear testing, the illusion has turned inward. It is no longer about spreading ideals. It is about convincing ourselves that superiority still exists. We test not because the enemy doubts us, but because we doubt ourselves. That is the final stage of illusion, when performance replaces confidence and fear masquerades as strength. Empires sustain illusions through ritual. Rome paraded its legions long after its treasury emptied. Britain celebrated its navy while ceding dominion. The United States, armed with media and myth, does it through narrative control. We speak of defending freedom while censoring dissent, of spreading order while fueling disorder, of deterrence while courting escalation. The contradictions are not accidents, they are the grammar of decline. When leaders can no longer align rhetoric with reality, they govern through perception. The danger is not just deception of others, but self-deception. A republic that believes it cannot fail will not reform. It will double down on delusion until the cost becomes unbearable. The illusion of omnipotence blinds even the military establishment. We speak of near-peer competitors as though parity were temporary, as though history were a series of inconveniences to be overcome by budget increases. But no amount of funding can buy coherence, and no modernization program can compensate for strategic drift. The empire's strength is real, but its purpose is hollow. Deterrence without direction becomes reaction. That is where we stand. Now, reacting to others' initiatives, defending positions that no longer matter, mistaking inertia for resolve, the tragedy is not that America lacks power, but that it no longer understands how to use it wisely. When illusion governs command, decline accelerates silently. The empire of illusions is not sustained by enemies abroad, but by the comfort of denial within. And like every empire before it, we will discover that illusions, once shattered, leave nothing but the truth we refuse to face. Every empire, at the end of its long arc, confronts the same truth. Power is finite. And history does not negotiate. For the United States, that moment is here. The illusion of limitless reach, of being able to shape events from Europe to the Pacific, from the Persian Gulf to cyberspace, has collided with material and moral exhaustion. Our rivals no longer fear us, they calculate around us. Our allies no longer trust us, they hedge against us. We still possess the largest defense budget in the world, but resources cannot restore coherence once purpose is lost. The lesson that Washington refuses to learn is the one every empire has learned too late, that power, unbounded by discipline, collapses under its own weight. The nuclear tests, the posturing, the rhetoric of strength, all of it reveals not confidence, but anxiety. Not control, but reaction. This is how empires end, not with surrender, but with overreach disguised as resolve. Limits are not weaknesses, they are boundaries of survival. In the discipline of strategy, recognizing limits is the first act of wisdom. The Soviet Union learned it when its empire bankrupted itself in Afghanistan. Britain learned it after Suez, when economic dependency made imperial pretension impossible. The United States has not yet learned it because our geography has protected us from consequences. Two oceans shielded us, and technology extended our reach beyond reason. But deterrence cannot compensate for strategic incoherence, and nuclear power cannot substitute for political unity. We now face the challenge that every dominant power eventually meets the need to adjust ambition to reality. To maintain stability, we must choose where to stand firm and where to step back. Without that discipline, we will continue to exhaust ourselves in peripheral struggles while neglecting the core of our strength, an economy that can sustain defense, a society that believes in purpose, and a command system capable of restraint. The tragedy of the current moment is that we are relearning lessons once known by our own strategists. General Eisenhower warned against the military-industrial complex. George Kennan warned against the illusion of universal mission. George Marshall insisted that power must serve policy, not replace it. We have ignored all of them. Our doctrines now chase contradictions, promoting global democracy through endless war, securing peace through perpetual escalation, claiming deterrence while provoking confrontation. We test nuclear weapons to prove credibility, yet every test reveals our insecurity. The lesson of limits begins with humility, accepting that no nation, however powerful, can impose order on a world that has rejected it. The future will not be shaped by unipolar commands, but by multipolar balance, a structure that demands patience, diplomacy, and understanding, not dominance. For me, as a soldier and strategist, this is the bitter truth of experience. Strength without restraint is self-defeating. Power without vision becomes chaos. Deterrence without dialogue becomes a trap from which no nation escapes unscathed. If the United States is to survive the collapse of its strategic order, it must rediscover the principle that built it in the first place: prudence. To recognize limits is not to admit defeat, it is to ensure survival. History will judge us not by how loudly we brandish our weapons, but by whether we possess the wisdom to stop before they became irrelevant. Empires always die the same way they exhaust themselves fighting the world instead of understanding it. The question now is whether we can learn that lesson while there is still time to act upon it.